In 2006, Pastor Lazelle Boudreau reported a tragic accident that claimed the lives of his wife and daughter. According to church records, both were buried days later in a closed casket ceremony attended by hundreds of mourners. 10 years later, during a mega program at the same church, 2 women walked in, alive. The man behind the pulpit froze. Witnesses say he appeared disoriented. His elderly mother, seated in the front pew, began to tremble. Within minutes, officers entered the building. The service never resumed. Behind the resurrection of these women lies a case of generational abuse, deception, and a church manipulated into silence. What began decades earlier as an unspoken family secret would unravel into one of the most disturbing revelations the town had ever seen. For years, Reverend Lled Boudreau stood as the spiritual backbone of a mid-sized Southern congregation in Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana. A reserved but commanding figure, Lled led his ministry with discipline, often keeping his personal life guarded from public view. His wife, Odeline, was quiet and deeply involved in church operations, often leading women's prayer groups and administrative duties. Together, they cultivated an image of respectability and stability, one the congregation rarely questioned. But over time, Lled Boudreau, according to close friends and elders in the ministry, grew increasingly concerned about the dynamic he witnessed in his home. One longtime associate, Ellison Price, later revealed that Lled confided his suspicions privately in the months before his passing. Price stated that Lled noticed behavioral changes in his son, marked by withdrawal and emotional detachment, as well as an almost unnatural obedience to Odeline, even in matters where Lled had made opposing decisions. No formal confrontation ever occurred between Lled and Odeline. However, according to Price's later testimony, Lled had begun compiling written notes regarding certain incidents he believed required attention. These documents were never found after his death. In March 1997, Lled died in his sleep. No prior medical conditions were officially documented, and his death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. The attending physician, a known associate of the family and longtime church member, did not request an autopsy. Funeral arrangements were made quickly, and Odeline oversaw the entire process. Following her husband's death, Odeline became increasingly embedded in church operations. She was observed entering and leaving the church at irregular hours, often alongside her son. Church administrative staff noted that they maintained long private meetings behind closed doors, well outside standard ministry business. Over the years, and only after external investigations began, emerging evidence suggested that the relationship between Lazelle and Odeline had crossed normative maternal boundaries well before Lled's death. Testimony from law enforcement sources and internal psychological assessments would later describe the relationship as coercive in its origin, sustained through manipulation, and eventually continued with mutual consent. Investigators would later consider the possibility that Lled Boudreau's death may have been connected to his growing awareness of this relationship. However, due to the absence of a post-mortem examination and the passage of time, no conclusive forensic evidence could be obtained to support that theory. The case remained closed. After assuming full pastoral leadership in his father's church, Lazelle Boudreau began facing increasing pressure from senior members of the congregation and church elders to marry. In many Southern Pentecostal congregations, especially in rural Louisiana communities, the expectation for a pastor to have a wife was not only cultural but institutional. It was viewed as a sign of spiritual maturity and leadership stability. In early 1998, approximately 1 year after Lled Boudreau's death, Lazelle formally announced his engagement to a fellow church member, Tamara Purnell. Tamara had been a background figure in the church for years, quiet, disciplined, and known mostly for her voice in the choir. Church members described her as kind but reserved, often keeping to herself and maintaining a modest lifestyle. Background checks later confirmed that she had been raised in foster care and had no known living relatives. According to church archives and interviews with longtime members, Tamara had admired Pastor Lazzell from a distance prior to their courtship. However, those close to her noted that their relationship progressed unusually fast. Within weeks of their engagement announcement, a modest church wedding was held with Odeline Boudreau presiding over most of the planning and logistical decisions. Post-investigation reports revealed that Tamara's personal life was deeply intertwined with the church. Having no family of her own, the church became her entire support system. She lived within walking distance of the church, volunteered during the week, and spent the majority of her time in church-related activities. This isolation from external social circles was later cited by investigators as one of the key reasons her disappearance raised minimal alarm beyond the congregation. Following the wedding, Tamara moved into the Boudreau residence, which remained occupied by Odeline as well. Witnesses described the arrangement as unusual, but not entirely surprising given Odeline's long-standing influence in her son's life. At the time, no one questioned it publicly. For the first few years of their marriage, there were no outward signs of dysfunction. Tamara continued her involvement in the choir and women's ministry, while Lazzell's sermons grew in reputation. However, law enforcement documents and forensic psychological reports released years later would point to a different reality within the home. By the early 2000s, Pastor Lazzell Boudreau was seen as a strong leader in his church and community. 2 years into the marriage, the couple welcomed a daughter, Kaylin Boudreau. Her birth further elevated the family's public image. His wife, Tamara, and their daughter, Kaylin, were always by his side during public events. But later investigations showed that behind closed doors, Pastor Lazzell was living a very different life. According to reports, records, and survivor testimony, Lazzell had continued his intimate relationship with his mother, Odeline Boudreau, even after he got married. Their connection was kept hidden from everyone. They would meet when Tamara was busy at church or taking care of their daughter. No one knew this was happening at the time. One man, a technician who fixed air conditioners, later told investigators that he visited the Boudreau house several times. He said the pastor and his mother were often alone together. He also noticed how quiet the house felt, and said the two of them acted more like a couple than mother and son. But since he had no proof, he never told anyone. Neighbors later said they often saw Odeline going into Lazzell's study late at night, long after everyone else seemed to be asleep. Tamara, according to later findings, began to notice that things didn't feel right in the home. Investigators found online searches she made in private. She had looked up topics like distant husband, controlling mother-in-law, and feeling alone in marriage. These searches were done quietly, and she didn't share these concerns with anyone at church. That double life continued for years, until a delayed flight changed everything. In late October 2006, Tamara Boudreau made travel plans with her daughter, Kaylin. According to later findings, they were scheduled to attend a weekend women's conference in Baton Rouge. Kaylin insisted she'd follow her mother, who was the primary participant. The flight was set to leave from the regional airport late Friday afternoon. Witnesses and airport records confirmed that both Tamara and Kaylin checked in on time and waited at the terminal for several hours. However, due to sudden changes in weather conditions, multiple flights were delayed. Rain and heavy winds led to cancellations, and announcements were made about possible rescheduling. Eventually, with no confirmation about when their flight would be cleared, Tamara decided it was better to return home. Their bags were still with them, and no hotel arrangements had been made in advance. A church driver had dropped them off earlier that day, but with the delay, they hired a taxi back to the house. They arrived home shortly after 9 p.m. Kaylin entered the unlocked house first. She walked in through the front door and went straight into the main living room. Moments later, loud screaming of "Mummy!" was heard from inside. Tamara, who was still outside paying the cab driver, rushed in and found her daughter disturbed. What she saw next triggered immediate confusion and panic. Clothing was scattered across the room. Odeline was visibly exposed and attempting to cover herself. The living room appeared disrupted, and Lizelle was standing pantless and frozen. Investigators later described the scene as visibly chaotic and deeply disturbing, based on the survivor's account and crime scene reconstruction done much later. Pastor Lizelle attempted to calm them down and led them further into the house, away from the front door. What happened next was quick and violent. Inside the master bedroom, investigators believe that Tamara continued asking questions and attempting to leave. It was during this moment that Lazel, in a reported panic, picked up a heavy flower vase from a nearby shelf and struck Tamara multiple times in the head. She fell to the floor, unresponsive. Kaylin was also hit in the head with the same object, but not as hard as her mother. Based on the later medical report, both mother and daughter suffered blunt force trauma to the skull. Tamara lost consciousness immediately. Kaylin was badly injured, but remained alive. With no medical help called and no neighbors alerted, they were wrapped in bed sheets and placed in the back of Lazelle's vehicle. Sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., Pastor Lizelle and his mother transported the bodies to a wooded area about 5 miles from their home. It was a trail often used by hunters and known only to locals. Using a shovel kept in the church maintenance shed, they dug a shallow grave and placed both bodies inside. No one in the church was aware that anything had happened. By sunrise, Pastor Lizelle was back in his pulpit. In the initial hours following the burial, there were no reports of anything unusual from the Boudreau household. Church members believed Tamara and Kaylin were away on a trip, and Pastor Lizelle proceeded with weekend programs as usual. He led Sunday morning service without hesitation, offering a sermon described by attendees as strong and spirit-filled. No one suspected what had occurred 2 nights before. According to later investigation, the plan was already in motion to build a narrative that would explain the disappearance. Pastor Lazel told church elders that Tamara and Kaylin had traveled for a weekend women's event and would be staying longer due to travel delays. This message was passed to the wider congregation without question. Meanwhile, back at the wooded burial site, something unexpected happened. On the night of the burial, a homeless man named Moses Hanks was walking along the nearby dirt road. Moses was known in the area for collecting bottles and sleeping near the edge of the woods. According to his later testimony, he saw faint light beams coming from a vehicle deeper into the trees. Curious but cautious, he waited at a distance. Moses said he saw 2 people digging. He couldn't make out their faces clearly, but identified one as male and the other as older and female. He watched them lower what looked like wrapped objects into a hole before driving off in silence. He approached the area slowly, unsure of what he had witnessed. After some time, he reached the site and began pulling at the dirt with a broken tree branch. Beneath the loose soil, he uncovered what appeared to be fabric. Moments later, he found an arm. He stepped back, but upon closer look, he noticed slight movement. One of the victims was still breathing. Moses ran to the road. It was late and traffic was sparse, but he flagged down a vehicle within 10 minutes. The driver happened to be Ellison Price, a retired church elder and longtime friend of the late Reverend Sherrod Boudreau. Price was returning from an out-of-town church meeting and had taken the back road as a shortcut home. He stopped immediately. Price recognized Moses and listened as he explained what he saw. The two returned to the site, confirmed the presence of two bodies, and Price used his mobile phone to call a private doctor he trusted. Rather than alert police immediately, Price made the decision to keep the situation confidential until he understood exactly what had happened. His history with the Boudreaux family dated back decades, and he had once been warned by Sherrod about Odeline's strange influence in the home. Now, those suspicions appeared to have new weight. The doctor arrived within 30 minutes. Upon examination, it was confirmed that Kaylin was still alive, though in critical condition. Tamara showed no signs of life but was still transported with care. Both were rushed to a nearby private clinic, and arrangements were made to keep their identities hidden. Price, believing the full truth would not be believed without protection, made the decision to take responsibility for their safety until further steps could be taken. Within 24 hours of being buried, Kaylin Boudreaux had survived what most wouldn't. She would remain unconscious for several days, while her mother's condition remained uncertain. Investigators would later call this moment the break in the case that was never supposed to happen. Back at the church, Pastor lled Boudreaux continued to preach. After many weeks, Tamara regained full consciousness and was able to confirm the series of events that took place on the night of the attack. She recalled returning home unexpectedly due to a flight cancellation, Kaylin entering first, and the moment she walked into the house and saw what had taken place. She remembered her husband's attempt to calm them, the blow to her head, and her inability to move afterward. Investigators would later use this statement to reconstruct the timeline. Their statements were recorded by Price and later verified during formal interviews. At this point, Price made the decision to contact a former state investigator he had once worked with during a church-related property dispute. The investigator agreed to review the information and help develop a long-term safety plan for the victims. The risk of returning them to the area was considered too high. With the help of the investigator and a small legal team, new identities were created for both Tamara and Kaylin. They were relocated to a different state, placed in a safe residence, and advised to avoid contact with anyone from the church or the Boudreaux family. To maintain the illusion of their deaths, no missing person reports were filed. Price, along with the investigator, gathered enough evidence to begin compiling a case, but knew they needed more time. They also feared that, if the police were brought in too early, the victim's safety could be compromised. The decision was made to wait until the right moment came to confront the truth. Meanwhile, back in Plaquemine Parish, Pastor lled Boudreaux later informed the church that his wife and daughter had died in a tragic accident while away on travel. He arranged a private funeral service with closed caskets. According to church records, no one from outside the congregation was present, and no one questioned the lack of official documentation. The burial was carried out at a remote church-owned cemetery plot. Odeline was seen comforting mourners throughout the event. Witnesses described the pastor's eulogy as emotional and filled with faith. He said that God had called them home for a higher purpose. In the weeks that followed, the church community embraced him with sympathy. Attendance grew, donations increased, and no one knew that both Tamara and Kaylin were still alive, watching from a distance, waiting for the day they would return. Price continued to support them financially and emotionally, acting as the only link between their new life and the world they had left behind. Over time, they adjusted to their new surroundings. Medical treatment continued under different providers, with Kaylin receiving ongoing therapy for trauma-related symptoms. Tamara, though stable physically, remained cautious, rarely leaving the house except for work-related obligations. According to later court records, the decision not to contact law enforcement immediately was based on two main concerns. First, the women feared retaliation. Second, Price believed that without clear, documented evidence of what happened, especially without physical proof from the burial site or witnesses willing to testify, there was a high chance the case would be dismissed. He also understood how much influence Pastor Lazelle Boudreau still had in Plaquemine Parish. A rushed report could lead to a cover-up or dismissal by local authorities. Instead, Price, now in his late 70s, focused on gathering evidence quietly over the next several years. He also kept contact with former church staff and quietly asked questions without revealing the full truth. Most people assumed he was writing a memoir or planning a church history project. No one suspected he was building a criminal case. The date was chosen carefully: the 20th anniversary of Pastor Lazelle Boudreau's church. It was scheduled to be the largest service the church had ever hosted. And it would also be the last time Pastor Lazelle Boudreau stood freely behind that pulpit. The church auditorium was at full capacity, and extra seating was set up under tents outside. What no one in the audience knew was that 3 plainclothes officers from the State Investigative Bureau were already positioned inside the building. A separate team waited nearby in unmarked vehicles. They had been briefed on the full history of the case, had verified the medical and witness documentation, and were operating under sealed warrants prepared days earlier. At exactly 6:47 p.m., during a musical interlude between segments of the service, 2 women entered the church through the rear double doors. They wore neutral clothing and head coverings. Most people did not recognize them, but according to eyewitness accounts, the moment Pastor Lazelle saw them, his expression changed. He was seated near the pulpit, reviewing sermon notes. Several witnesses stated he stood up slowly, looking directly at the aisle as the women walked forward. One usher described his face as drained of all color. Kaylin Boudreau, now 16, walked directly to the front and stood near the podium. Her mother, Tamara, followed closely behind. In the crowd, murmurs began to spread. Some recognized their faces. Others watched in silence. Standing just feet from the man who had once left her for dead, Kaylin turned toward the congregation. According to the official report and footage later submitted into evidence, she calmly requested the microphone. The worship leader, confused but compliant, handed it to her. What followed was a direct statement of fact. No emotion, no drama. Kaylin identified herself and her mother by name, confirmed that they were alive, and declared that they had been attacked and buried by Pastor Lazelle Boudreau 10 years earlier. She provided the date, location, and names of the people who had helped rescue them. She then stepped aside and allowed her mother to speak. Tamara addressed the congregation briefly. She confirmed the events of October 2006, explained their disappearance, and stated that they had waited a full decade for the right moment to return. She then asked everyone present to remain seated as law enforcement entered. At that moment, plainclothes officers approached the stage. Pastor Lazelle did not resist. He was placed in handcuffs and escorted out of the sanctuary. Odeline Boudreau, seated in the front row, was also taken into custody. According to arresting officers, she did not speak a word. The congregation remained silent. Some wept. Others stood in disbelief. For years, they had believed a narrative built around trust, faith, and image. Within 15 minutes, that image had collapsed. The anniversary program was never completed. Visitors were escorted out slowly. Security teams cleared the building. The church board issued an immediate statement of shock and called for prayer. And after 10 years in hiding, Tamara and Kaylin Boudreau stood side by side. no longer victims, but witnesses to the truth. Following the arrests, Pastor Lazel Boudreau and his mother, Odeline Boudreau, were taken into custody by state authorities and held at separate detention facilities pending investigation. The charges included attempted murder, aggravated battery, conspiracy to commit homicide, unlawful disposal of a human body, and obstruction of justice. Additional charges relating to long-term abuse and psychological manipulation were filed against Odeline Boudreau following separate psychiatric evaluations and recorded testimony. Court documents filed in the weeks that followed laid out the full timeline. The ongoing inappropriate relationship between Lazel and his mother, the suspicious death of Reverend Lled Boudreau, the rushed burial of Tamara and Kaylin, and the false narrative presented to the congregation. A forensic review of church records also raised questions about misused funds, particularly in relation to the closed casket funeral expenses and the undocumented burial site. The church shut down all operations temporarily. Board members resigned in clusters, while some leaders went into seclusion. Internal reviews confirmed that no one within the current staff had been aware of the crimes committed, but the damage to the church's name was permanent. The building was later sold to a separate ministry. A memorial plaque once mounted in honor of Tamara and Kaylin was removed. During pre-trial hearings, both mother and daughter appeared in court under their legal names but were identified publicly in connection with the case. Tamara gave a short statement during a procedural appearance, thanking the few individuals who had helped protect them and stating that truth took a long time, but it came. Kaylin remained mostly silent during proceedings but was present at each hearing. Pastor Lazel's legal team initially entered a plea of not guilty, but later requested a psychiatric evaluation. The results showed no signs of mental illness that would excuse criminal responsibility. Odeline Boudreau, due to her advanced age and declining mental state, was deemed unfit for full trial and was committed to a state mental health facility. She died 2 years later from natural causes and never issued a formal statement. In the final ruling, Lazel Boudreau was convicted on multiple felony counts. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He was removed from the state clergy registry, and all previous religious credentials were revoked. He is currently serving his sentence in a maximum security facility. Tamara and Kaylin Boudreau have remained outside the public spotlight since the trial. They declined interviews and did not take part in documentary projects that followed. According to one of the former investigators, they relocated once again shortly after the sentencing and chose to live a private life away from church systems. Their return, 10 years after being buried alive, marked the end of a story built on silence, power, and deception. And with their testimony, the legacy of the Boudreau name was brought to an end, not with prayer or praise, but with the truth that was never meant to be heard. He buried them, he preached over them, and he built a ministry on their silence. But the truth rose from the ground and walked straight into his church. If this case shook you, share it. Someone out there might be living under the shadow of manipulation, power, or control, and they need to know that silence doesn't have to last forever. Subscribe to True Crime Corner for more cases that expose the darkest secrets hiding in plain sight. Because the truth always finds a way back.